Assalamualaikum and good day. So the aims of this lecture for you to be able to identify the structure and explain function of the central and peripheral nervous system. So that I would like to remind you, do not share this video without consent from the author, which is me. Okay, so this video was made specifically for my students that register under course of physiological psychology under A2. Okay, so firstly, we would like to look on the anatomical subdivision of the brain. So our brain is divided into three main major division, which is forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. And for each major division, divided into another subdivision, and also under this subdivision, there are principal structure that very important in controlling our behavior. So we look first on the forebrain structure and function. So forebrain is the most dorsal division of the brain. Okay, the most dorsal division of the brain, and the forebrain consists of telencephalon and diencephalon. What is dorsal mean? Dorsal is defined as the upper side of the brain. Okay, as you can see, it's the upper side. The telencephalon is upper side part. The diencephalon is the lower part. So this consists of the forebrain in the front of our brain. Okay. So now we look on the telencephalon. Okay, telencephalon, which is include cerebral cortex, the basal ganglia, and also our limbic system. Okay, this picture actually show this cross section of our human brain. So from this cross section, we can see clearly the cerebral cortex, which is it's surrounded by the cerebral hemisphere that look like a tree. Okay, and as you can see, that cerebral cortex in the upper side, which is a gray matter. And interesting about cerebral cortex, it is actually greatly convoluted, and this convolution consists of sulci. This is a small groove, fissures, the larger grooves. Okay, and a gyri is a bulges between adjacent and sulci or fissures. Okay, so these are just at the anatomical structure of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so as you can see in the lower section of this slide, I include the YouTube. Okay, so you can follow the YouTube video to look further how actually all of this section was explained clearly about the anatomical of the human brain. Okay, now in this slide we look on the structure of the location. Actually, we look on the location of lobes of the cerebral cortex. Okay, location of the lobes of the cerebral cortex. How many lobes in the cerebral cortex? There are four lobes. Okay, so the main lobe is frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and parietal lobes. Okay, so the frontal lobe, okay, so actually it include everything in front of the central sulcus. As you can see in the pink side, the central sulcus, there is the frontal lobe. Okay, whereas the temporal lobe is just forward of the base of the brain. Okay, it's a forward, it's still at the front side but at the base of the brain. Okay, called as temporal lobe. Okay, and occipital lobe is situated at the back of behind of our brain. Okay, so it's closer to the parietal and temporal lobes. Okay, as you can see from this view, is situated like near to each other but in different location. Okay, so why is important for us to know about location? Why? Okay, because each of these lobe have different function. Okay, so it's related with how our brain damage. Okay, how actually not our brain, how actually the brain damage might occur. Okay, so if like any brain injury happen, sometimes it's not happen in all lobes. It's only happen at certain specific lobes, okay, during the accident, for example. So this this damage or injury causing the behavior changes that related to that specific lobes only. Okay, so next, beside then the main four lobes of frontal lobes, temporal, occipital, and parietal lobes, okay, in our cerebral cortex also consists of main sensory cortex, three main sensory cortex, which called as primary visual cortex. Okay, as you can see, the red color, okay, the red color at the behind side, okay, and which is important to receive visual information. Okay, so it's located near to the occipital lobe. As we know, occipital lobe is strongly related function with visual. Okay, so this is called as primary visual cortex in the red color section. Okay, next next location of function that related with sensory cortex is primary somatosensory cortex. Primary somatosensory cortex, which is the blue color. Okay, the blue color. So the primary somatosensory cortex is important in receiving the information from our body sense. Okay, it's important in receiving information from our body sense. Okay, so the third sensory cortex is primary auditory cortex. As you can see, is in the green color. Okay, primary auditory cortex, okay, in the green color. So its function to receive auditory information, which is it is also located at the temporal lobe. Okay, in temporal lobe is very important and related with function of language. Okay, hearing and language. Okay, so please remember, this is the three main areas of cerebral cortex that receive information from the sensory organ. Okay, now the next only the one function that we not discuss yet, which is the pink, the dark pink. Okay, the dark pink, which called as primary motor cortex. Primary motor cortex. So what it is the function of a primary motor cortex? Okay, it is important. Okay, uh, involved in perceiving and remembering. Perceiving and remembering in planning and execution of the movement. Okay, is important in perceiving and remembering in planning and execution of the movement. Okay, so any movement of behavior is related with the primary motor cortex. So as you can see, okay, primary motor cortex is located, okay, this is the dark pink color, is located just in front of the primary somatosensory, okay, and also the frontal lobe. Okay, so in primary motor cortex is connected to muscle in different part of our body. Okay, so is connected near to the somatosensory, and also is near to the lobes. Okay, so it's important, as you can see, because of the location. Okay, how actually it receive the sensory, and also it involved in a movement of the particular part of our body. Okay, so this is the summary of each sensory cortex that I mentioned just now: the primary visual cortex, auditory, and also somatosensory. Okay, I also already mentioned briefly about the main function and the location of the three main sensory cortex. As you can see in this slide, okay, as you can see in this slide, the three main sensory cortex and the primary motor cortex occupy only a small part of our cerebral cortex. Okay, therefore the other function of cerebral cortex, which consists of the four main lobes, okay, it accomplishes what is done between the sensation and our action, such as in perceiving, learning, remembering, planning, and also acting. Okay, so all of these action take place in the association areas of our cerebral cortex. So as you can see, okay, as you can see, in temporal lobe is divided into auditory association cortex and visual association cortex. Same as occipital lobes is involve the visual association cortex, and the parietal lobes includes the somatosensory association cortex. Okay, whereas for frontal lobe is divided into premotor cortex and also prefrontal cortex. Okay, so this region uh, make it possible by integrating the information from more than one sensory system. Okay, from more than one sensory system. How does it occur? The central sulcus of the cerebral cortex provide an important dividing line between the rostral and caudal region of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so, the rostral region involved in the movement-related activity, such as planning and executive behavior, whereas the caudal region is involved in perceiving and learning. Okay, and each primary sensory area of the cerebral cortex send information to the adjacent region called the sensory association cortex. So the circuit of neuron in the sensory association cortex analyze the information received from the primary sensory cortex, and the perception take place there, and finally the memory is restored. Okay, since this region is integrated to each other, there are possibility for these different region to integrate information from more than one sensory system. Okay, uh, if a brain injury occurred, okay, or for example, like if people sustain damage due to the somatosensory association cortex, so the impairment are strongly related to somatosensation and to the environment in general. So they may have difficulty to perceive the shape of object that they can touch but they cannot see. Okay, they can touch but they cannot see, so they may have difficulty to name part of the bodies. Okay, to name part of their bodies. So this deficit that involved with somatosensation might involved with the incapability perceiving shape, unable to name part of the bodies, and also trouble in drawing a maps. Okay, so now I would like to test your understanding. Okay, what happened if destruction occurs to the primary visual cortex? And what different, okay, what different if the structures occurs to the visual association cortex but not in the primary visual cortex? Okay, so that is my question that I need you to answer during the SCTL learning letter, right? So please prepare for the answer based on the case study in the textbook. Okay, of Mr. M, that having a sustained intracerebral hemorrhage due to stroke and causing damage in at his left parietal lobe. Okay, left parietal lobe. Okay, so he have difficulty. Okay, he have difficulty with his sensation. Okay, with his sensation, where actually he understand the physician question when he was asked to point out part of his body. Okay, he could repeat the names of the body part when he listened, when he hear from the doctor. Okay, however, he could not identify which body part of the names he referred to. Okay, so this the impairment called as autotopathy. autopagnosia. Okay, autopagnosia. Okay, so also known as a poor knowledge of one's own topography. Poor knowledge of one's own topography that is specifically related with the damage of left parietal lobes. Okay, left parietal lobes. Okay, so parietal lobes actually involved with the space. Okay, the left parietal lobe is involved with the space, whereas the right parietal lobe is involved with external space, and the left parietal lobe actually involved with the one's body and personal space. Okay, so this disorder, okay, is under the umbrella of agnosia. Agnosia is actually is general term of the disorder, okay, and then depends on which part of the lobe is damaged. Okay, so for example, like in this case, is damaged to the left parietal lobe, so it's called as autotopagnosia. Okay, autotopagnosia. So this disorder causing inability of the person to interpret sensation, okay, and also causing them difficulty to recognize things. Okay, so for your further information, please go through the YouTube explanation on agnosia, okay, according to the link that given in this slide. Okay, now just now we already discussed on the sensory cortex and also the different function of the sensory cortex. Now I will look on another cortex, which is called as motor cortex. Okay, motor cortex. So motor cortex is divided into three sections: primary motor cortex, motor association cortex, and also prefrontal cortex. Okay, prefrontal cortex. So primary motor cortex mainly involved with control of movement. Motor association cortex or premotor cortex, okay, involved with directly controlling our behavior, and prefrontal cortex involved with the control of formulating our plans and also instructions. So we already cover all these cerebral cortex component. Now we look on the lateralization of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so as we can see, actually our cerebral cortex is divided into two hemisphere, the right and also the left. Okay, the right and also the left hemisphere. So although the two cerebral hemisphere does cooperate with each other, but these two hemisphere do not perform identical function. So right and left have two different function. Okay, both have two different function. So in general, the left hemisphere participate in the analysis of the information by extracting the elements that make up the whole of an experience, controlling sequence behavior, and also involved in verbal activities, talking, understanding speech of other people, reading, and also writing. Okay, whereas the right hemisphere is specialized for synthesis process. Okay, for synthesis by putting isolated element together to perceive things as a whole picture. Okay, as a whole picture. And right hemisphere also involve in abilities such as draw sketches, read maps, and also constructing the complex objects. Okay, constructing the complex objects. So what component that is important to connect between right and also left hemisphere? What component? Okay, the important component called as corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. Okay, corpus callosum is important. Okay, it's important to unite both right and also left hemisphere. Okay, because of these two different functions which involve the perception and memories, and is united by corpus callosum, which is consists of the large band of axons that connects corresponding parts of the cerebral cortex of the left and hemisphere. Okay, and because of corpus callosum, each region of the association cortex knows what is happening in the corresponding region of the opposite side of the brain. And the corpus callosum also makes a few asymmetrical connections that link different regions of the two hemispheres. Okay, in this slide, I share with you a link to a YouTube on a life of a stroke survivor, but how actually she adjusting herself with the impairment due to the stroke. Okay, so it's quite interesting because it is quite long videos around 20 26 25 to 26 minutes. Okay, another component in the forebrain is a limbic system, which is important in development of motivation and emotional responses. Okay, so limbic system consists of amygdala, cingulate gyrus, limbic cortex, hippocampus, fornix, and mammillary bodies. And amygdala is quite common for most of the uh, neuroses disorders such as depression, because amygdala involved in the feelings and expression of emotion controls, emotion memories, and recognition of the sign of emotion in other people. Okay, next is the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are a collection of nuclei below the cortex of our forebrain, which lie beneath the anterior portion of the lateral ventricle. So, the major part of basal ganglia are caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. Okay, so it's important because it's involved in the control of our movement. For example, like Parkinson's disease is caused by degeneration of certain neurons located in the midbrain that send action to the caudate nucleus and the putamen in the basal ganglia. So the symptom of this disease are weakness, uh, tremors, rigidity of the limbs, poor balance, and difficulty in initiating the movement. Okay, so next we'll see the picture of the location of basal. So as you can see in this figure, there is the basal ganglia. Okay, where it's also situated near to the thalamus and hypothalamus, which is under the diencephalon. Diencephalon is the second major division of the forebrain. Okay, and it's situated, as you can see, it's situated um, between the telencephalon and mesencephalon. Okay, so I will go next to thalamus and hypothalamus. So the forebrain is divided into thalamus and hypothalamus, where thalamus is important in relaying sensory signal, motor signal to cerebral cortex, and regulation of consciousness and sleep and alertness, whereas hypothalamus is important in controlling our autonomic nervous system and endocrine system in producing hormones that link through pituitary gland. Okay, and hypothalamus also is important in organized behavior related with survival of species such as fighting, feeding, fleeing, and also mating. Okay, this is the mid-sagittal view of a part of the brain, specifically to look on hypothalamus. As you can see, it is the blue color. It's very small structure. Even though it's small, it's very important. Okay, it's very important. So hypothalamus is very important uh, in producing cells to control the uh, pituitary gland. Okay, to control the pituitary gland. So there are two types of pituitary gland, which is called as anterior and also posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so a special system of blood vessel directly connects the hypothalamus with the anterior pituitary gland. So as you can see, pituitary gland also is near to the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamic hormones secreted by specialized neuron called as neurosecretory cells that located near the base of the pituitary stalk. So please look at the picture. So from the hypothalamus, the hormone actually being secreted, especially to the pituitary gland. Okay. So this hormone stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to secrete its hormone. And for example, the important hormone in anterior pituitary gland is gonadotropin releasing hormone that cause anterior pituitary gland to secrete the gonadotropic hormone, which play a role in reproductive physiology and also behavior. Okay, and um, most of the hormones secreted by anterior pituitary gland control other endocrine gland. Okay, because of the function of anterior pituitary gland has been called as the body's master gland. Okay, body's master gland is important for the gonads, such as ovary and testes, because to release male or female hormones, and it also have two other anterior pituitary hormones such as prolactin and somatotropic hormones, which is for the growth hormone. Okay, whereas hypothalamus also produce the posterior and pituitary gland, which important in secreting the oxytocin, which stimulate ejection of milk and uterine contraction at the time of childbirth, and also vasopressin, which regulate urine output by the kidney. Okay, so uh, these hormones are produced by neurons in the hypothalamus, which the axon travel down to the pituitary stalk and terminate in the posterior pituitary gland. So it's very interesting. If you can see, it's a very small structure of the brain. Okay, it's very small structure of our brain. You can see from the bigger in the left picture. It's happen in the middle of our brain, and it's a very small structure that, but it's involved a lot of function that control our body, which involving the secretion of the hormones. Okay, so this hormone of the posterior and pituitary gland are carried in vesicle through the exoplasm, and this neuron and collect in terminal buttons in the posterior pituitary gland. When this axon fires, these are just a process. When the axon fires, the hormone contained within the terminal button is liberated and enter the circulatory system. Okay, to our system lah, basically circulatory system, basically in our body system. Okay, so it's very interesting. Next, this is actually the summarize of the anterior and posterior pituitary gland functions. Okay, now we look on the midbrain, which is mesencaphalon. Mesencaphalon is divided into tectum and tegmentum. So there are different function or subdivision of tectum and also tegmentum. So this is just the summary of the function that respective to the subdivision. For example, like superior colliculi involved in the visual system, inferior colliculi involved in auditory system, and same as reticular formation involved in sensory information, aqueductal gray matter involving control sequence of movement that constitute of special typical behaviors such as fighting and mating. Okay, and red nucleus and substantia nigra is involved in the motor system. This is just summarized. So the hindbrain is divided into metacephalon and myelencephalon, where actually the principal structure of these two subdivision involved in cerebellum and pons, whereas myelencephalon involved in medulla oblongata. So these also are the summary of both subdivision, whereas cerebellum, please remember, cerebellum involved in impairment. I think we learned during our, I think in physiology during fourth or during in secondary school. Okay, cerebellum important in balancing. So it's important for walking, standing, and performance coordinator, and whereas pons involved in the portion of reticular formation, which is involved in sleep and our arousal. Whereas for medulla oblongata is contain part of reticular formation that controlling including nuclei, that control vital functions such as regulation of cardiovascular system, respiratory, and also skeletal muscle tone. Okay, so that's the picture of our cerebellum and also brainstem. Okay, for your view. So now we enter the second phase of our lecture, which is the structure and function of the peripheral nervous system, PNS. So based on the previous lecture on CNS, as you can see, I try my best to summarize the main structure, okay, and the related function, the main structure and the related function. So as you can see in my handouts, I will give you actually I attach also handouts on the CNS and PNS. So some of the description is quite detailed, which they involve the anatomical identification of each structure. But for me, for a psychology student, you don't really need to know on the anatomical part, but important for you to know the structure, the name, the specific jargon of this structure, and the main function. Okay, because as psychologists, we need to know when we receive referral. Usually, the referral gave based on the which location of the brain damage and what structure that is impacted, and from there will give us idea what function that might been disrupted in our patients. Okay, so now we look on the peripheral nervous system. So the introduction of PNS. So basically our brain and our spinal cord is communicate with the rest of our body through the cranial and also spinal nerve, which is called also as peripheral nervous system. Okay, so now the peripheral nervous system is divided into spinal nerve and also cranial nerve. Spinal nerve is sympathetic branch, whereas the cranial nerve is a parasympathetic branch. So now I explain a bit about the cranial nerve. Okay, cranial nerve is actually attached to the ventral lower surface of the brain, and there are actually 12 pairs of cranial nerve that serve the region in the head, neck, and thoracic and abdominal cavities. And most of the cranial nerves serve sensory and motor functions of head and neck region. For example, like the somatosensory information is received via the cranial nerve. Okay, so but except for the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve, is the regulate function of organ in thoracic and also abdominal cavity. So as you can see in this picture, okay, in this picture, all nerve is important to convey message, sensory information to CNS and convey message from CNS bodies, muscle, and glands, which is the blue one is the afferent sensory, whereas the red one is the efferent sensory. Efferent meaning what? From our side into the brain, whereas the efferent is from the brain into outside. Okay, how actually our message being transferred. Okay, so as you can see, most of the nerve, okay, serve our sensory and motor function. So it's involved the tongue movement. Okay, if you could look on the number 11, okay, in 12, neck muscle for number 11, tongue movement for number 12, olfactory, okay, for smells, okay, and then number 2, optic for vision, okay, and then the third, oculomotor, trochlear, abducent, touch, pain, okay, face muscle, our taste, auditory, hearing, balancing. Taste is involved the sensory and also our motor function, except for number 10, the vagus nerve is the only cranial that regulates function of organ in thoracic and also abdominal cavity. Next, we look on our spinal nerve. Okay, spinal nerve actually begin at the junction of the dorsal and also ventral roots of the spinal. Okay, dorsal and also ventral roots of our spinal. Okay, so the pathway of spinal nerves consists of afferent axon and also efferent axon, meaning that out and in. Okay, the neurons are involved in taking the information out and in from the spinal to our other muscle. Okay, so the nerve leave the vertebral column and travel to the muscle or sensory receptor and vice versa. Okay. look on the cross section of the spinal cord. Just now we just look on the whole features of the spinal nerve. Now we look on the cross section of the spinal cord, one of the spinal cord. Okay, so as you can see, okay, in the picture, okay, the afferent, okay, the afferent axon brings in the somatosensory informations to the spinal cord that reside in the dorsal root ganglia. Whereas, okay, look at the arrow, okay, with the light blue color, that is the efferent axon that brings out, or they actually leave the spinal cord through the ventral roots that control muscle and gland. Okay, so meaning the direction is outward away from the central nervous system. So this figure shows the routes taken by afferent and efferent axons through the dorsal and also ventral roots. Okay, don't worry, so you don't have to remember all the terms in the spinal cord, but it's important for you to know at least there are afferent axon and efferent axon, and what the difference between these two axons. Okay, and next, sympathetic division. Okay, next subdivision of the PNS is the sympathetic division. The portion of autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic division, is control functions that accompany arousal and expenditure of energy that causing the fight reactions. Okay, the fight reaction. So what is the fight reaction? It's involved in the sympathetic nervous system that increases our blood flow to skeletal muscle and stimulate epinephrine hormone to increase our heart rate and blood sugar level. Okay, so these cell bodies of sympathetic motor neurons are located in the matter of thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Okay, and parasympathetic division, I think most of you knows about the parasympathetic division, is a portion of autonomic nervous system. Okay, it's a portion of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, it's control function that occur during the relaxed state. Okay, it's occur function during the relaxed state. Is involved with the increases of the body supplies of stored energy such as salivation, gastric and intestinal motility, secretion of digestive juices, and increased blood flow to gastrointestinal system. Okay, and it's located in the nuclei of the cranial nerves and sacral region of the spinal cord. Okay, so inside the spinal cord. All right, so that's it for our lecture. Okay, so what you can do, you can look, you can read further in the handouts actually that I scan in the textbook, but actually the handouts from the textbook is much more complicated because it's involved on the anatomical explanation of each part of the structure. Okay, so my slide, I focus more on the structure and function. So also I take it out from the textbook. Okay, and second, you also can go through all the YouTube link that I insert in my slide. That is good for you to know, to read further, to have information, more information from their video, especially in the earlier slide where I include a YouTube link to explain on this, on our brain function and lobes. Okay, and it's interesting because it's also include the 3D figures of the brain lobe. Okay, and the third one, please read through the learning activities where I include some important question that might be helpful for you to read further to understand for your quiz. Okay, and actually the main thing that you have to do for this for physiological psychology, kan, physiological psychology is involved a lot of fact, so you need to read and memorize. So for the test, lots of the question involve memorization of the structure and also the function. Okay, I think that's all for me. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.